It's been a while and we're going to kick it off with a bang in today's video by looking at two of the most underrated vehicles that are within World of Tanks at tier 10 as heavy tanks, and they are of course the ones we have on screen right now. And of course these tanks are starting off with the WZ-111-5A and of course the later going on to the Object 277, and both are really interesting replays that we've got here for you today. And we're going to talk about the differences between the two and why they are so underrated within the game. Now first off, let's talk about the differences between them, and you have some significant differences when it comes to how they can play, but the general play style of these tanks is very similar, which is why I combine them into one video and why I think people should definitely give these tanks a little bit more credit than they actually are getting at the moment. So first things first, damage per minute. What do they look at? Well, the WZ-111-5A is sitting at around 2,700 base damage per minute with a reload speed of 10.7 seconds. So that is the base reload. Of course you can get that down to probably in the region of about 9 seconds to fully reload if you've got all of the perks and you're using everything to your advantage to boost that up, which is pretty decent and allows you to kick out a decent amount of damage. And talking about damage, 490 damage per shell, which means that these tanks are capable of dealing with a lot of the other vehicles at tier 10, the heavy tanks, but they also play very much like the mediums, which gives you that advantage over the medium tanks because they typically have, you know, 390 to 400 alpha roughly, depending on what tank you're looking at. Some have higher, some have less, but primarily when you're coming up against those medium tanks, which these tanks can certainly do with the other attributes that they have, they're really strong in those sort of engagements where you aren't having to just sit there and side scrape for the entire time, although some of them can do potentially. It's not the best feature of these tanks, and it's really about the movement and the kind of gun handling that these tanks provide over something like, for example, an IS-7. Now, am I saying that these tanks are better than an IS-7? Maybe not, but at the same time they do provide you with a ton of things that you can do. And within this game so far there's been 4,800 damage picked up, which is really good, and it showcases that, you know, you can maintain a good damage output with these sorts of tanks, as well as being able to be a little bit flexible. Now talking about flexibility, the Chinese tank actually has more gun depression than the Object 277, and that is because the WZ-111-5A gets to 7 degrees of gun depression, which is of course way more favourable when you're trying to take ridge lines, when you're trying to actually move about the map. The 7 degrees of gun depression really do help this tank out, whereas the Object 277 only gets 5.5 degrees, so a little bit lackluster in that department, but it's still workable, and I mean it's similar to the other Soviet heavies, and definitely capable of being used. It's nothing like you're getting 1 degree of gun depression or something ridiculous, but it is the feature of this Chinese tank to get the additional bit of gun depression. It's why a lot of people prefer this one over the 277 because it offers that flexibility, as well as having the fact that this tank is faster at reloading, so it has more gun depression and it reloads faster. It also gets more base armor than the Object 277, which makes it a little bit better at being able to at least bounce rounds according to its armor thickness, but maybe not the actual way in which the armor is laid out. So the 277 seems to be a little bit more bouncy from what my personal experience is. I mean, does it really bounce a whole lot? Probably not. I mean, premium rounds will butter both of these tanks quite easily if they find that hull armor, but the turret armors are fairly kind of bog standard when it comes to your heavy tanks. You know, they are fairly reliable. You can use the turret armor, and you really have to rely on people not hitting the cupolas of the two tanks, even if they are quite small. But yeah, this tank in particular does get those advantages. It also you know, gets a few other advantages which come in signal range, but you guys know not really anything worth talking about. But there are a few negatives when it comes to this tank over the 277, and that is that the 277 gets 55 kilometers an hour top speed, whereas this only gets 50 kilometers an hour, and as well as that, this tank has worse power to weight ratio, which means getting up to the top speed of 50 kilometers an hour isn't as easy as you would with the 277. So There's a whole host of different things between the tanks, but they're primarily just very small bits. You know, you have these small attributes of the tank, but the way in which they play very similar, as we were talking about earlier. And so when you are playing in tanks of this, obviously the enemy team not realizing how consistent that this tank can be when it does get up close and personal, and with 0.37 accuracy that this tank has base, means that you can actually manage to connect shots like this at somewhat decent ranges up against things like the Tortoise, and you have the hope of at least bouncing a few rounds as well, and failing that you can always load the premium, making it 10 times easier to basically pen the Tortoise, and that's because 340 heat pen on the WZ-111-5A makes it a little bit easier to do that. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what you guys actually think about these two tanks and how you feel like the gameplay in these sorts of things really suits the current meta within World of Tanks, because there's a whole host of changes that Wargaming are introducing. There's been tons of different changes that they've been adding into the game of recent updates, so it'd be interesting to see what you guys are thinking as they are currently within the game. So when you do get into this sort of position on Westfield, you want to make sure that you do push over to this location, because it provides you with cover from people that are going to be camping in these sections and the dips that you see over here, as well as people that are going to be sat in the bushes down here. And it allows you to prepare yourself up against anyone that's going to be cresting that ridge. There are a few ridges that you have to be a little bit aware of. People can poke here and they can get hold down over here, but obviously with teammates in this location, it's really going to be fine. I mean, if they poke him, they're going to get taken out by the FV or anything else that's going to be over there. But a nice little shell into the FV 4005, exactly what you want to do. And now just pulling back to this location, which essentially provides you with a little bit of a dip, enough to hide this tank. And considering that this tank is a pretty low profile nature compared to some of the other heavies, it's really not a problem. But what is a problem is a YOLO wagon Tortoise who's just come over the hill, and unfortunately he low rolls, but don't worry, because his teammate in the T30 finishes him off. Lovely, lovely work, securing a little bit of damage extra in this game and picking up nearly 10,000 damage so far. And I'm sure that our player here is waiting to be able to get that 10k damage mark, and it only is one more shell, and it's really surprising how quickly the damage racks up in the WZ-111-5A, and it really is an interesting one to see played in action. So let's skip ahead to some more action and see exactly how this game starts to end up. Now unfortunately our player doesn't manage to get any more damage onto any of the actual tanks, and it's left down to just the artillery piece at the end of the game. He makes a beeline for the forested area where the arty always camp, and with the high alpha damage that this tank gets, he shuts down that artillery to end over 10,000 damage. And what a great result in a tank that people always forget about within World of Tanks. And underrated is definitely the feature of the second tank, the 277, as we've been talking about, and that is because very similar to the WZ-111-5A, people think that this is just kind of one of those boring tanks that you see within the game that just doesn't really offer a lot, but it's because of that consistent damage gun that this tank has, as well as the fact that it does have a little bit of bouncy armor. It looks awesome within the game as well, and it definitely plays very well too, and that allows you to really come into pure conflict with some of the other heavy tanks within the game, and how you can dominate in scenarios like this up against something like a Maus, where you just have that DPM advantage, and also where you do have that armor advantage, even though the Maus is supposedly the armored version of tier 10. But you know, with this being World of Tanks and World of Premium rounds, it doesn't really work out all too well for the Maus, and you're seeing here yet again using the heat rounds that the Object 277 has of the exact same penetration of 340, allows you to essentially just rinse through the Maus's turret. Not a lot he can really do here, and just some really good aim to go in there. A nice little aggressive push at the beginning of the game racks him up 2,500 damage up against this Maus. And that is really what the 277 can do, because some of the other heavies that you see in the game, things like the Type 4, the Type 5, you know, all of the slow boys, the Maus and the Maushan, you know, all of the super heavy tanks, they just don't have the ability to get into position like these sorts of tanks do, like this, the IS-7, the WZ. They're all very much kind of relying on that armor, whereas this is a good combination between armor and usability with regards to gun handling, mobility, etc. So The 277 is one of my favourite tanks because it really gives you all of that, and you feel like you can really impact the game with this tank, whereas in some of the other vehicles you feel like maybe you just don't have the DPM to do it, maybe you just don't have for example the mobility to turn around and impact different flanks, whereas this really does cover all bases. And that's how you've been able to see him get down into the dip in the early game. Obviously a risky strategy, but it works out quite well here. And obviously you can bounce a few rounds as you come in. But at this point it's time to be aggressive and push this Object 277. Or 777-2 even. God, I was being a bot there, but we managed to shut down a little bit of damage on this 777, and it's now time to really stick in and trade. And this is what this tank is all about, getting up close and personal, finding those weak points, pinpointing them using the decent accuracy. And in fact that this tank actually has better accuracy than the WZ, not by much, only 0.01, but it is slightly better. And so when you combine that with the mobility, the accuracy, and also just the kind of pure grueling nature that these Soviet heavy tanks offer you, and yeah, you can have some brilliant games. And so far, not having received a single hit with this tank, and able to pick up over 4,500 damage, make that nearly 5,000 damage within the first 4 minutes of the game. So really nice result here. And of course now able to place rounds into the backside of the 60TP, who's obviously feeling a little bit butthurt about that one. And you can see him now trying to just do what he can do best, but unfortunately for the 60TP it is all curtains, and the 277 shuts him down. So why I like these tanks and why they are underrated in my opinion is because people often think that they can essentially just, you know, charge into them, they're going to bounce, they're going to basically pen every single shot, they're not going to bounce any rounds, and they're just going to be able to out DPM them. But when in reality, a lot of the time the people who end up YOLOing into these vehicles end up being out traded, they end up bouncing, and they also end up basically not realizing the armor capabilities that these things have, and so it basically ends up with this scenario where you find a lot of players just don't give them enough credit, and you can take advantage of that to really take away a lot of their hit points as they kind of YOLO you. Obviously YOLO meta in World of Tanks, we all know about it, it's very common, but yeah, certainly these tanks definitely feel like they're taking out that YOLO meta and taking out their frustration on it. So as you can see here, now just trying to push towards the last remaining hit points in the game. Obviously the game is still very much active, and it's now just a case of hunting down the last opponents that he can find nearby, and then kind of develop that game strategy against some of the other vehicles, like you're seeing the T-55A in the top corner of the map in the northeastern area, to try and support his 121B, as if you lose that area you often end up with kind of an encirclement, and then it just ends up being a shit show on this map in particular. But able to get up into this spot, and from here you can essentially just get into the bushes and you can remain undetected. Obviously against a convoy you're not going to be able to fire and remain undetected for the most part at that sort of distance, which isn't the worst, and at this point it doesn't really matter all too much, and it's just mainly about pushing out as much damage as possible and recouping some of that damage that we're seeing here and the disparity between his team and the enemy team. And that is what he does, shutting a shell straight into the Shah MLE even, and he's trying to scurry off with that little auto-loading light tank, but scurry off not very far before the second shell lands. And there's an FV4005 who've now pushed from behind along with this T10, so focus the low health targets, really good shell in there, and he thought about going down by the looks of it right there. But of course going down against an FV4005 is not the best idea, since that one has a very big one, if you get my drift. So yeah, you don't want to be going down on that boy, and he's going to definitely shut you down pretty quickly. And when you've only got a small amount of hit points left comparatively to the alpha of the FV, then yeah, it's not looking all too good. And he takes one shell from the Progetto, obviously the autoloader or auto reloader, and then the FE actually manages to miss, which is a big misplay by him, and he's ended up down in the bowl, which is obviously not the best situation for the FE either. So really good way in which to come out of that, still alive. So 9,000 300 damage done, and the FV looks like he's going to come round for another swing, and is he going to miss again? Now FV's turning round for the STRV. Is it on the team? Yep, the 103B. He manages to miss by the looks of it, and now it's just a case of getting an easy shell into the side of him. Unfortunately, no HE so far with this tank, which is kind of disappointing since you would end up with, I believe, 580 alpha with these HE rounds. I'll just double check that for you guys. No, 640, so even better. And of course, if you can land a few rounds on things like the waffle, etc., then yeah, it's going to be perfect to carry at least maybe 1 or 2. And even if you come up against arty at the end of the game, some of the tier 10 artillery, you can shut them down in one shot. So far, game's looking pretty kind of similar. I mean, it's definitely on the losing end so far, but there's still room to be able to win it. They're only up by, what, 1,000 hit points, which isn't the worst in the world. It's just a couple of shells. So you just have to maintain that kind of distance and also just maintain a cool head. And when you are in the 277, that is what is going to yield you the best results. Things like this and the WZ. Often you'll see people trying to act as if they are the super heavy tanks, which is obviously why you see a lot of tanks and players playing in these tanks being very, very lackluster in their performances. It's because they think that the armor and they think that everything is going to work out just like a super heavy. But you really have to play these like armored mediums. Think of it almost like a 430U or that sort of vehicle where you have to be aggressive but not too aggressive to the point where you're kind of getting YOLO'd or anything like that. And unfortunately doesn't manage to connect with the T55A with that round. Now, in order to save you from having to watch him hunt down the last remaining vehicles, we skip ahead and he manages to find the T10, who's still sat in the exact same spot as he was earlier. And that is, of course, the Tier 9 version of this tank, the Tier 9 Soviet tank that was actually one of the oldest vehicles and actually led on to the IS-7, but of course now leads on to the 277. And the T10 is very much a similar sort of playstyle, probably a lot worse in the current meta, of course not quite as powerful as it once was, but unfortunately the T55A does manage to actually land a round on him, and you can see here that the turret traverse just kind of a little bit too slow, and unfortunately this tank comparatively to the WZ actually has worse kind of traverse speed, which is disappointing, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and that allows him to try and go for the last remaining shell on the T55A, and he does manage to shut him down. Of course, a 3-mark player here, very, very skilled one. And yeah, Necron SV having a brilliant game in the 277, and hopefully that's given you a good overview of both of these vehicles and why you don't want to just say, oh, it's only a 277, because it will definitely come back to bite you on the backside, as you saw with the 60 TP in this game. And yeah, don't forget that if you aren't already subscribed, please do, and make sure to like and just do all of that sort of stuff for the YouTube algorithm if you want to help me out. But other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, and I hope you join me in this video on screen, which is a perfect example of a more overpowered out-and-out vehicle.